In the modern video game market of any said year, there can be literally dozens of games released within that year. Even for those who consistently keep up with video game news, previews, and information, there can be games that some players have seen or heard about and quickly lose interest in those said games because of yet another possible game that might catch their attention. Through the years, there have been individual games that have been released and even franchises as well, but for one reason or another, none have had the staying power that others have been lucky to achieve. Some reasons can be developmental issues. A game might have been released by a company, even with sales and support for the game, nothing more comes out of it. Or pressure to release a game by the company to meet a certain deadline, or internal conflict between the company and the developmental studio. Especially in today's gaming market, a said game can have more than enough fan support, but if the studio isn't willing to take risks to develop a sequel, so a said game might be brilliant, but nothing more could or should or even can come of the concept, and all gamers have to wonder is what could have been. A game can also be the product of the times that it might be released in, which is why some games don't necessarily age as well as others. This video game discussion will be that of forgotten games. The said games and their statuses will be mentioned, but in no particular order will be given. Just games that modern players might not necessarily be familiar with. Bubsy. Bubsy was originally a platforming series like early Super Mario and Sonic the Hedgehog games were, but the character was never given the same amount of seriousness that Mario or Sonic did. The character was never really given that much credibility. The early games sold quite well actually, and the character was almost considered in the same league as Sonic for anthropomorphic animal characters. The first Bubsy game was released in 1993 for the Super Nintendo and was called Bubsy and Claude Encounters of the Third Kind. Sales upon release were rather well, and at the time there was more than enough room in the market for another mascot like Sonic or Mario. Bubsy would come back in a sequel in 1994, of which was called Bubsy 2. Bubsy would then come back for another game, but not on a Nintendo console but the Atari Jaguar, Bubsy and Fractured Furry Tales. But the decision to put the Bubsy franchise onto another console would not necessarily be the decision that killed the franchise. The game that did was Bubsy 3D, considered by many now to be one of the worst games ever made and released for any console. Added to this, Super Mario 64 was released on the exact same day. The game is a sort of paradox because at the time of release, the reception to it was actually positive. Some commentators call Bubsy 3D a prelude to modern 360-degree open-world games that are now standard. Retroactive reviews of the game, meaning modern reviewers reviewing the game at the time, call it bad, for some reasons calling it a poor transition from 2D to 3D, and the dynamic engine of it being off, and even calling the game not necessarily Bubsy like prior games. There were initial plans to bring the Bubsy franchise to the Sega Saturn, but the ideas were later abandoned. One reason why Bubsy did not last much is that the Bubsy franchise drifted from console to console, developer to developer. Mario and Sonic remain on Nintendo and Sega consoles respectively, so the fan base built up and those who played the games became loyal. Bubsy did not have that, as players of one game with one console were not about to buy another game for another console. It didn't make much sense to do that. In 2017, Bubsy would actually return for the first time in 21 years with Bubsy, the Woolies Strike Back. The theme of the game has Bubsy going against the Woolies, the antagonistic villains from the first Bubsy game so many years prior. Though there was optimism with the fact that this would be a franchise that could possibly be revived, but that was short-lived as most considered the game to be average at best. Gex, or Jex depending on your pronunciation, lived in Hawaii with his family. His mother stayed at home to help raise him and his 3 siblings while his father worked at a job for NASA. The life was uneventful and Gex was a carefree youth. One day his mother got a call on the phone that changed his life. The call said that Gex, his father, and some other volunteers died in an explosion at a rocket pad testing operation area at a NASA base where his father worked. The carefree Gex was devastated at the loss of his father. While Gex's mother and siblings dealt with the loss normally, Gex himself on the other hand withdrew mentally and started to watch television and do nothing but sit in front of a screen for hours a day. In an attempt to get Gex from watching television, she moves the family to California and takes away Gex's television. As a result of this, Gex runs away from home, living on the streets for a period of time. He eventually obtains a small amount of money and uses it to return to Hawaii. Using the remaining money, he buys the world's biggest television set. One day while watching, a Han emerges from the screen and pulls him inside. The one who pulled him inside was Rex, ruler of the media dimension, and plans to use Gex as his mascot in an attempt to rule the world. Throughout an adventure, Gex eventually defeats Rex, and upon his victory he says, quote, "Hey, cool, I wonder what's on HBO," end quote. Gex was released in 1994. The Gex franchise was a rather dark series even by modern standards. Dealing with the death of your father by watching television? That's original. A sequel was made in 1998 as he spent his time watching kung fu movies and became a secret agent. Gex fights Rez once again, but during the conflict, Rez says that he's Gex's lost father. The whole feeling was similar to that of Star Wars. Gex 3, Deep Cover Gecko, is even more of a departure from the original, being released in 1999. It's clear to say that Gex is a franchise that departs massively from the original story. As mentioned, the original was dark and depressing. The television addiction aspect of the game was also toned down, to make Gex more of a social icon that used television for heroism rather than denial about the death of his father and him being lazy. Dino Crisis. In the mid to late 1990s, there was the Biohazard series which focused on zombies. Capcom proposed ideas to see what else they can do with the horror survival concept that they were building. Soon they had an idea. Dino Crisis. Everything that Resident Evil had, but with dinosaurs. The first Dino Crisis was released in 1999, the second being in 2000, and the third finally being released in 2003. The actual storyline started with the first and continued with the second, with the third being unrelated to the prior two games. There has been occasional internet discussion that the franchise could be possibly brought back, mostly by people who played the original two games. If so, the concept can be entirely redone, as the idea is still valid and original. Parasitic Eve. One of the few examples of a formerly dead franchise being resurrected in some form. The first being released in 1998 and the second in 1999. This was a series that was rather unique. Much like Resident Evil and Dino Crisis, this dealt with the paranormal and parasitic organism themes. The game franchise itself would be eclipsed by Final Fantasy VIII and IX that came out around the same time. Ironically, the paranormal aspect would be used in some form of another for Resident Evil 4. Another reason why the series attracted a lot of attention at the time was because of the main character, Aya Brea, who is considered racy and sexualized. The third birthday attracted controversy because the PSP did not have numbers sufficient to the PlayStation 3 or 4, with the third birthday being only released on this handheld console, and was seen as a ploy by Sony to encourage or even force people to buy the PSP, because at the time, though the PlayStation Portable had games, numbers weren't high enough in some as the company predicted. This was why the third birthday was never ported to a console, and as a result, any possible hopes for truly reviving the Parasitic Eve franchise is still dead. Vector Man. Released in 1995 for the Sega Genesis, the story takes place in 2049 where the human race is trying to colonize planets in an attempt to leave the Earth. Quote-unquote Orbots have been left behind by humanity in an attempt to clean up the planet, which has been mostly polluted. Raster, a high-ranking Orbot who observes the entire planet's status through a computer network, accidentally goes insane when he's connected by a mental link to a working nuclear missile by a lower-ranking Orbot. Renaming himself Warhead and proclaiming himself Overlord of the Earth, he swears to kill any human who tries to return to the planet, and the Vector Man that you play as decides to save the world and stop Warhead. In the sequel, released in 1996, has Vector Man return to Earth to find that it's under the control of an insect queen, and Vector Man, played by you once again, has to save the world from an insect army. Reception for both games was mostly positive, though Blue Sky Software, the company that developed Vector Man for Sega, closed in 2001. Plans for a third game were underway before being cancelled completely in 2003. Early proposals were for it to be a complete reboot, with a complete overhaul of the game, and if the game had proceeded, it would have been nothing like the first or second Vector Man games. Earthworm Jim, one of the most essential and arguably popular game series of the early to mid 1990s, is Earthworm Jim, and to this day, many are still surprised that Jim isn't still around. The first Earthworm Jim game was released for the Sega Genesis in 1994. The sequel was for the Mega Drive in 1995. Reception and praise for the series concept was very good, and Jim actually had more games such as Earthworm Jim 3D in 1999, and even a proposed PSP game that was cancelled. Even an animated cartoon that existed for 2 seasons in 1995 and 1996. Even a comic book line and action figures were made for Jim and related characters. One possible reason why the character lost its appeal is because Jim is from the early 1990s, and such themes and attitudes aren't exactly popular anymore. F-Zero. During the early 1990s, there were some attempts at reinventing the racing genre. One of the best well-known at the time was F-Zero. The story behind the game is that in the far future, multinational billionaires are so bored with their wealth, they decide to create and fund a new type of racing format based on the Formula One method. Modern gamers know about one of the characters from the series, which is Captain Falcon, who is often seen in the Super Smash Bros. Series. Though the series has been mildly successful, it's not necessarily as well known as other racing franchises. Paperboy. Paperboy was a multi-platform game with releases in 1985 and later in 1992, having games on the Atari, Super Nintendo, and Game Boy consoles. The plot and overall theme of the game is delivering newspapers to houses across different levels. During its day, it was mildly successful, but with modern technology, such a game concept is obsolete. Earthbound. Known in Japan as Mother, it's considered one of the best games ever released. Being released in 1994, it actually had a limited release outside of Japan, so many gamers in America missed out on the concept of Earthbound. And nearly all European countries never even heard of the game until years later. A third game, Mother 3, was never released outside Japan. Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars. Released in 1996, and according to some, this was the only real time that the Super Mario concept was actually put into a role-playing format. Mario is known for platforming, but this game is considered to be, by some, the best ever made in terms of role-playing, and never truly duplicated. Though Paper Mario for the Nintendo 64 is sometimes considered a sequel, to have a real sequel to the stars might never happen. Bloody Roar. First released in 1997, the concept of this series was that certain humans had the ability to transform into animal-human hybrids and were ostracized throughout history because of this ability. Though the series never became truly mainstream, it had 4 games released to it. With video games, there are countless games made. As mentioned before, these are just some of the games that were forgotten for whatever reason. Perhaps some of these games might have revivals someday, perhaps not. What is known is that for those who play these games, they are never truly forgotten.